Welcome back. All right, I'm going to talk about the Blackhawks today because we keep talking about rebuilds. Tear it down, tear everything down, just tear it, all of it, tear all of it down. All of it has to go. Every player, get them all out. Just fill the lineup with whoever. The sooner you can get everybody out, the better, because that's what the Hawks did. And yet that's not what the Hawks did. So I wanted to talk about this because the Chicago Blackhawks of the late 90s, early 2000s was very dysfunctional. This was a team that was trying to make things work. The early 90s, Chicago was pretty good, right? And they were pretty good with this guy Chelios on their team. Chelios was still there when things went bad, and they got really bad. But I don't know how much of this is by design. Now, eventually, management figures things out, and they'd get the ship righted. But I wanted to talk about this because we talk a lot about, retools, rebuilds. And the rebuild for Chicago was kind of a forced rebuild. This was a team that, through bad drafting and bad trading, became a pretty hard-to-watch team for a long period of time. So it starts in 97-98, where they're outside the playoffs. They have a record of 30, 39, and 13. 73 points, Craig Hartsburg behind the bench. And I loved Craig Hartsburg, the player. As a coach, he did have his challenges. Bob Murray was the general manager for the team at the time. The 1998 draft, at 8th overall, they drafted Mark Bell, who would make the NHL and played well for a time there. Tyler Arneson was drafted 183rd. So he did make the NHL, and it shows the importance of being able to get those hits in the late round. 98-99, the record gets worse. Dirk Graham was the coach. That didn't work, so they went to Lorne Mollican. They ended up with a record of 29, 41, and 12, 70 points. Chicago fans right now are nodding going, yeah, the Dirk Graham era. Yeah, it didn't last very long. The 1999 draft, they drafted Steve McCarthy, 23rd overall. And there wasn't anything notable outside of that. So it was tough. 99-2000, record of 33, 37, 10, and 2. The four columns era begins. So 78 points. Lorne Mollican was replaced by Bob Pulford. Bob Pulford would also become the interim general manager. It's never a good thing to have to go to the interim general manager, but it does happen. 2000-2001, they bring in Alpo Suhonen. I wanted to talk as well about this because this is a big thing. In 2000, they have the number 10 and the number 11 draft picks. They drafted Mikhail Yakubov and they drafted Pavel Vorobiev. And there was hope that these, young Russians would come in and make a big difference, and they didn't. Both players ended up flopping at the NHL level. And so that was kind of just a lost draft in 2000. They weren't the only team that had a lost draft in 2000. Now we'll talk about 2000-2001. Trying to get the team back into the playoffs and believing they're not that far out, Alpo Suhonen's hired. And this is always the discussion. Why aren't other European coaches hired? Well, Ivan Halenka was hired by the Penguins. That didn't go well. Alpo Suhonen's hired by Chicago. That didn't go well either. They end up with a record of 29, 48, and 5, 71 points. Mike Smith became the general manager that year. If you're not aware of Mike Smith, that's fine. Until I was researching this video, I'd kind of forgotten he had been the general manager of the team as well. Generic name probably doesn't help. 2000-2001 at the draft, they did a little better. Number 9 was Tuomo Ruutu, and number 73 was Craig Anderson. Neither of them would be with the team that eventually would win the Stanley Cup in 2010. But nobody was looking at this team at this point and saying they are a bastion of how to do a rebuild. This was, what a disaster this team is. So they hire Brian Sutter. Under Brian Sutter, the record gets a lot better. They ended up 41, 27, 13, and 1. Record of 96 points. They did lose in the first round, but things were looking up. Now, what's interesting is they got off to a really hot start that year under Brian Sutter. Great, a lot of energy. And then they fell off after the All-Star break, and in the first round, they looked bad. Right, they looked bad in the first round that year. In the 2002 entry draft, they ended up drafting Anton Babchuk, number 21. But the important picks are not first rounders. Number 54, Duncan Keith, who would play on that 2010 Cup winner, and Adam Burish, number 282. He would play on that Cup winner. So that's the thing. When people talk about, well, you got to tank. You have to get hits outside of the first round. You have to. You can't just go, hey, we just need that number 1, that number 5 pick, and we're good. You have to get hits outside the first round. So 2002, 2003, with Brian Sutter still behind the bench, things fall apart. 30, 33, 13, and 6 for 79 points. The 2003 draft, there's some hits here. The number 14 pick is Brent Seabrook. The number 52 pick is Corey Crawford. There's no asterisk there because when they won the Cup in 2010, he was not a goaltender there yet. But he would, of course, win a Stanley Cup with Chicago, a cup or two. Dustin Byfuglien, number 245 that year. So again, they get a big hit with Dustin Byfuglien, and that's a year after they get Burish at 282nd. Scouting is very, very important. So we can look at, for this year, it's everybody's, go after Bedard. Bedard's the big prize, but they have to be able to draft outside the first round. If you can't, it's not going to work. You keep getting those high-end guys, yes, who end up being very expensive, but you don't fill out the rest of that roster with good young players who can play various roles. So, and for Byfuglien, he could play all kinds of roles. 2003, 2004, the last year for Sutter, and Bob Pulford would take over at this point as the general manager. He didn't stay. He was kind of there for the time being, but they ended up with a miserable record that year. 20, 43, 11, and 8, 59 points. The 2004 draft, they had the number 3 pick, Cam Barker. He would end up being traded during the 2009-2010 season, so he's not part of that Stanley Cup winner. But look at the hits they get outside the first round. Dave Bolin, number 32. Brian Bickle, number 41. And Troy Brouwer, number 214. All three of those players part of that 2010 Stanley Cup roster. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 players drafted outside the first round who end up being part of that 2010 Stanley Cup roster over a period of 3 years. So tanking, yep, that's fine, that's great, all this, but getting those hits, really, really important. 2005, of course, that draft is a draft without a season. They drafted Jack Skilly, 7th overall. The skill was there, it never ended up happening at the NHL level, ironically with the last name being Skilly and all. But drafting 108th, they got Nicholas Hjalmarsson. Hjalmarsson would end up being part of that Stanley Cup roster as well. Then you get into the 05-06 season. Trent Yanni's the coach. Dale Talon takes over as the general manager. They ended up with a record of 26, 43, and 13, 65 points. And in the 2006 draft, they draft Jonathan Toews at 3rd overall. And outside of that, not much. It is interesting to note that once you get into the drafts that lead up to this, while they had great drafting here, the drafting actually kind of falls off after that. 06-07, they end up 31, 42, and 9. Trent Yanni still behind the bench to start the season, but it would end with Denny Savard behind the bench. So 71 points for them that year, and they draft Patrick Kane 1st overall in 2007. But this was a team that, because of the picks they'd made before, and because of some of the moves that they've been making, the team is moving up the standings. So 2007, 2008, again with Savard behind the bench, they're 40, 34, and 8, 88 points, and now they're becoming that sexy pick to end up being a playoff team. They look dangerous. Looks like this is a good young team. What's Chicago going to be able to do? That year, they drafted Kyle Beach 11th overall, and we know how that story ended. Terrible story overall. And so that's the interesting thing, too, is the last year before they made the playoffs, there wasn't anything outside of that first round either that was of note. So 2008, 2009, they get into the playoffs. They're 46, 24, and 12, 104 points. But they had a coaching change during that season. Denny Savard starts the season. It's not going well. So he's out. Joel Quenneville is in. And I remember there being defenders at the time of, well, Savard's not the problem. I don't know how this is going to change things. But Quenneville turns it around. Stan Bowman then took over for the 2009-2010 season after Dale Talon had a couple of reasons that he'd end up being moved on from. And, of course, we get into that era. But the 2010 Cup roster, I wanted to get into who's on the roster and how they got him and when. So there's Patrick Sharp. They acquired him, stole him from Philly in 2005. Marian Hossa signed as a free agent in 2009. Chris Versteeg was acquired in 2007. So this is the other part. You have to be smart with your trades. They didn't lose any of these trades. Andrew Ladd acquired in 2008. Brian Campbell acquired in 2008. John Madden signed in 2009. Thomas Kopecky signs in 2009. Colin Fraser acquired in 2004. Ben Eager was acquired in 2007. Brent Sopel signs there in 2007. Nick Boynton acquired in 2010. Antti Niemi signed in 2008. Cristobal Huet also signed in 2008. And when Antti Niemi was signed, he was virtually an unknown at that stage. So he would end up being their goaltender when they won that first Stanley Cup in 2010. And nobody saw that coming. And there was a lot of complaints about, well, yeah, they're good, but is Niemi really going to help them? Because until then, they'd had some pretty decent goaltenders in Chicago. So players of note that are on the roster, because again, we get into you got to tear everything down. Everybody worthy of note has to go. Whether it's Arizona, Chicago right now, of course. Chicago's doing that now, and it bewilders me. I don't understand this idea of tearing everything down that we're seeing teams do now, because it's really hard to build it back up. And Chicago never really did that. So 97-98, the roster here, it had Tony Amonte, Alexei Zhamnov, Eric Daze, Gary Suter, Chris Chelios, Jeff Hackett. Jeff Hackett in net, a goaltender with a poor regular season record, who honestly was a good goaltender behind bad teams. 98-99, Amonte's still there. Zhamnov's still there. Dougie Gilmour, Daze's still there as well, but I wanted to talk about others. Dougie Gilmour signs there. Yeah, so they bring in Dougie Gilmour because, again, they're trying to get back into the playoffs. Chelios, Olczyk was brought in, and Jocelyn Thibault was brought in net. Thibault was a good goaltender. So this was a team that was getting wins that right now people would be yelling about. Like, the goaltender's getting you wins. Get rid of them. 1999, 2000. Amonte, Sullivan, so Steve Sullivan's brought in. Gilmour's still there. Michael Nylander's brought in. And Boris Mironov was on the team as well. So again, there are some good veteran players here. 2000, 2001, you have Sullivan, Amonte, Daze. Thibault is still the goaltender. 2001, 2002, Daze, Zhamnov, Amonte, Sullivan, Thibault. So you have that veteran group. And I understand, like, the idea that, well, you could get a lot for players. You can, but you need to make sure you're keeping guys there, because you need to make sure that players know there's some stability on the roster, that there's a vision, sure, and yeah, there's going to be bad and all this, but there needs to be good players. So when you're looking at Arizona, you want to make sure that Clayton Keller sees the big picture and that he has good players to play with. When you're looking at the current Blackhawks, I think there's some good young players there that you want to keep around. Although they did trade Kirby Dach, I still thought that was a mistake. But at any rate, you have to have that veteran presence there, right? That's why you sign Domi. That's why you sign Athanasiou. Sure, they might end up being rentals at the deadline, but in the case of Domi, he's played really well. He's getting more goals and points than expected, and all signs point towards Chicago keeping him rather than trading him, even though his value right now would be higher than it was at the start of the season. But for Chicago not trading him, I think it's the smart move. So, where were we? Okay, 2002, 2003, they had Sullivan, Zhamnov, Daze. They also had Phil Housley and Theron Fleury join the team. So, again, they're not really of the mind that, okay, we're just going to be terrible, because 01-02 they made the playoffs. So 02-03 they're trying to backfill that and make sure they can get back, even though all the numbers would state they're probably not going to get there. 03-04, this is where things kind of do fall off. Berard, Sullivan, Daze, noteworthy, and Craig Anderson in net, who was a young goaltender coming up for them, who they had drafted, they would not keep. So then we go into 05-06, and this is where you can say, well, they're straight into the tank now with Yanni, and yet Yanni still ended up getting fired, so if they were fully in the tank. But anyways, Calder is on that team, Bell's on that team, both good young forwards. Seabrook, Keith, so now we're getting into your Stanley Cup winners are starting to show up. And Javi Bulin, who was a signing in 2005. They signed him for 4 years, and he would stay there, and then he would sign in Edmonton. Less of a successful signing with Edmonton, but he gave them capable goaltending. Honestly, again, they were winning games in 05-06. They maybe shouldn't have, because Javi Bulin could do that. 06-07, they had Havlat, Verbata, Rutu, of course they drafted, Keith, still there, and Seabrook, of course, still there, and Javi Bulin still in net. And then 07-08, there's Kane, there's Sharp, there's Toews, there's Keith, Javi Bulin still in net. You can see that there's a good core of players here, and the switch over from these veterans here to these veterans here didn't involve going through years of not having anybody. The idea that you don't sign and keep anybody because, well, you're going into a rebuild is I think foolhardy. And I've seen GMs kind of do that. There's this scorched earth thing about how to build your team, and I'm not sure what playbook they're following, because to me, Chicago didn't do that. This was a team that wasn't trying to be bad for most of this part here. They were drafting well. So they were taking advantage of the fact that they were drafting early. Yeah, sure. But their hits are generally outside the first round until 06 and 07. And so while Talon gets a lot of credit, you could also ask him, well, what happened with the rest of the draft picks those years? Right? So you get Toews and Kane, but you don't get the other picks outside the first round of note. And sometimes it can just be easy to go up there and go, yeah, we'll take that guy number one. That's an easy pick. What makes or breaks teams is those picks outside the first round. And one thing that certain teams in the NHL have struggled with is those picks outside the first round. One thing for the Coyotes that I've liked is a lot of the young players starting to come up onto their roster are guys outside of the first round. So that's noteworthy. I'm not saying they're going to be the next dynasty or anything, but it's important to be able to get those young players in. They're cheap with the salary cap where it is and all the cap problems around the NHL. Having guys on entry-level contracts is golden. Having young players that are able to play is fantastic. And so when we talk about teams that are, going through a rebuild or a retool, until you have a scouting staff that's able to get those guys outside the first round, I don't think there's going to be great success. So I'm less concerned about who's going to draft number one overall, who's going to get Fantilli at number two, if it's Fantilli or if it's Carlson, whoever it is. I'm more concerned about, so who's going to get those hits later on? Because both with this dynasty here, modern day dynasty, as well as the LA Kings definitely got some hits outside the first round. Jonathan Quick was not a first round draft pick. And not everybody was a number one overall. Remember Anze Kopitar, when he got drafted? There was a lot of, well, we don't know. And what's the strength of his competition is. The Kings just went up and went, you guys are crazy. We're going to draft this guy. And the Kings were right. The Kings were absolutely correct to do that there. And so I think that's something that gets lost in this, is the idea that, well, for our team to end up being the next Chicago Blackhawks, we need a Patrick Kane type. We need a franchise player. Yes, but franchise players don't necessarily just come first overall in that draft. You can find them later on. You can find them outside the first round if you have a really good scouting staff. And I think that's the storyline with the Chicago Blackhawks. Smart trading, signing the right players for the right cap hit, creating a situation where players know they're going to get taken care of, because you didn't just fire everybody out. You didn't just pitch everybody. And this is, again, when I look at teams now, I don't understand this strategy of we'll just pitch everybody, because it is, I would think it'd be harder to attract new players. I would think it would make it more difficult to then rebuild the proper way, because you're basically wiping out your entire home and then building from the foundation up, rather than saying, well, I think we need to redo this. The foundation's okay, and the foundation is your drafting. So that's the other problem. You can build the nicest house in the world, but if your drafting isn't any good, you're going to have a lot of guys who are overpaid, because you're not going to have kids coming in that can play, and so you're going to have to pay veterans to come in. The veterans are always going to cost more than the kids, and that's part of how Chicago got it done. But at any rate, smart general managers, yeah, sure, that's fine, but look how many coaches they went through. Look how many GMs they went through. And this is held up as this is how everybody should do it. Really? You want everybody? Because there are teams right now that are getting savaged for how they're running things that look a lot like this. And it is years. Notice it goes from 97, 98 to 2008, 2009. So it took over a decade before Chicago was in the playoffs, looked like they were an up-and-coming team and they were going to win a Stanley Cup. And a lot of that, not intentionally bad. So let me know your thoughts in the comment section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. I would also add Tampa Bay Lightning and how they put their team together is not entirely unlike this. So I can look at that at some point as well. Unlikely will. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.